2004 here in the state of Washington, we had an election that the book says, election of the ages. It's the closest gubernatorial race percentage-wise in the history of the United States of America.
The candidates were Christine Gregoire, who was a three-term Washington Attorney General and very well known, and Dino Rossi, who was a very well-known legislator who was chairman of the Ways and Means Committee and also in real estate. Things got really interesting during the primary. Washington's primary was tossed out by the courts, so we had no legal primary system in place. And Washington has this proud heritage of independence, and voters here just cherish it. And we've always been able to choose any candidate on the ballot, regardless of party affiliation. So the court throws out our primary, and we end up with a different primary system that forced people, for the first time, to choose a party ballot. And then Secretary of State Sam Reed had fought hard, and it had successfully passed the legislature for a top two primary that was very close to our old primary, knowing what this heritage was and what the voters wanted and would appreciate. And it passed, but then with the gubernatorial veto, we ended up with this other primary system. So he had fought for something that the voters wanted, and in the end was then charged as the Secretary of State at the time to educate voters about this new primary system that he had actually opposed. But his duty, of course, is to educate voters about the ballots that they'll see in this new primary. And so people just came. The emotions were very dramatic. And they started contacting our office. They wrote email, 16,000 phone calls in a day or something, which is, that doesn't happen on a daily basis at the Office of Secretary of State. They were offended that the right to vote for the person on the ballot had been taken away. They were offended by the idea that they then had to choose one political party's ballot. These are Washingtonians. We vote differently out west, and they weren't used to it. I was Sam's communications director at the time, so I was in charge of public affairs and media. So I was involved in the education campaign and a media contact and doing press releases and so forth. We wanted to be very transparent about with the public about the emotions involved and what was going on and why, and so we saved and documented all of those, the email messages and the correspondence with the office, and we held this press conference and we explained what was happening and why. But from our perspective, that was really the start. It was a different election cycle and unique from that point forward.
On election night, it became apparent it was going to be close. And it came a bit of a surprise because the Democrat, the Attorney General, was expected to win, and all of a sudden they saw this race end up coming closer and closer. But since we have so many people who voted by mail back at that time, we weren't really going to know till much later after all those mail ballots were counted. At this time, all ballots are by mail. Back in 2004, we had a mix of counties. Some were by mail. Many voters did it just by choice. So we actually ended up still with about 60% of the people voting by mail and 40% at the poll sites. At the conclusion of the original count, Republican State Senator Dino Rossi was certified by me to be governor of the state of Washington by a margin of 260 votes. So when you consider that's out of 2.8 million, it just was really unbelievable. Our state has very clear laws, which indicated at that time we had to have a recount automatically. But since it was a little spread, it wasn't going to be a hand recount, it was going to be a machine. But machine recounts are significant because the election workers go back, they review all the ballots to make sure that, they're voted correctly, and they often find mistakes. They find ballots that are a bit damaged and need to be fixed. They tend sometimes to discover errors they've made of perhaps some ballots weren't even counted. So it did change the outcome of the election down to the point that it became only a 46 vote margin by the time we finished the machine recount. But again, it was the Republican State Senator Dino Rossi, and I certified him as governor. But our laws, again, are clear that the losing candidate has a right to request a hand recount, but they initially have to pay for it. But if the count reverses the race, then they get reimbursed. And of course, I think logically, they did request a recount, and we immediately went into a recount by hand. That meant in each of the 39 counties that they had to organize themselves to go through each ballot one at a time. Also, our laws were very clear that the political parties had a right to have observers, so they were there. Plus, we had tremendous news media scrutiny, so they were there, and it ended up, particularly for the larger counties, of course, to take weeks, and it was just a pressure cooker in terms of what was going on out there in those courthouses. We were in a situation coming out of the 2000 presidential election where in Florida there had been a recount, and it was highly controversial, continued to be controversial 4 years later. It was a Republican Secretary of State oversaw it who was widely viewed as playing partisan politics. And here I was as a Republican Secretary of State overseeing these recounts. So it set up a climate where the voters of the state were very nervous. The Democrats were nervous because it is a Republican Secretary of State, and many of them were immediately suspicious that I was going to play politics. The Republicans were nervous because of how the race had tightened and how the trend was going in the direction towards the Democrat, and they were, of course, hoping that I could do something. So it set up a situation that was virtually one where I couldn't win, one way or the other. First, the Democrats sued me. It went to the state Supreme Court because they thought my rules for the recount were not broad enough. They wanted more ballots. They wanted to have the election people go back and re-examine. Even ballots have been rejected for lack of a signature in the mail ballots. I won a unanimous court decision, so the Democrats now are really angry with me. However, as the election, this is during the recount, and as the count was going on, all of a sudden it looked like the Democrat was going to pull ahead. And so the Republicans who'd been with me the previous week all of a sudden decided to sue me over the same issue because they now wanted more ballots to be counted. And went to Supreme Court. I won a unanimous decision. Now they're mad at me. So it was one of these that fits the old quote, is lonely at the top. It was very lonely at the top. With the hand recount, as we went along, it was very close, neck and neck, the reporting, and the votes were changing as, again, they were going over each ballot, looking at it separately, and they could see things that the machine couldn't see. So we're getting right down towards the end, and it was going back and forth. And then in the final analysis, the Democrat, Gregoire, ended up winning the hand recount by 129 votes out of 2.8 million. That is 56 ten-thousandths of 1%. One of the most important lessons, I think, for the public was how important it is that you be very conscientious when you vote, to actually follow the rules, find out what you need to do, because while there were many mistakes made in the election by election board workers and staff, vastly more were made by the voters. If they were supposed to fill in an oval, instead some of them would circle them or put an X next to it or something, and then the question is, well, what does this mean, And or they would use the wrong kind of ink that the machine couldn't read. They forgot to sign it. Women who had changed their names because, say, they got married, didn't bother to change their voter registration, so they signed with a different name, and all of a sudden the elections people are left saying, is this the right person? They didn't change their address. So the responsibility of citizenship in respect to elections is extremely important in our democracy, and I think this was a rather compelling lesson to people that they need to pay more attention, take their time, be conscientious, and do it right.
People don't think about elections. They're a very human process. They're a partnership between the administrator and the voter. The voter needs to follow instructions, mail those ballots on time. The elections administrator needs to do his or her job. And you don't think about it when the race isn't close or if the election isn't in the news. Once it is, all of a sudden, all the election mechanics take center stage. But one of the benefits is that it built momentum, and it gave the Secretary of State a rare opportunity to make changes to election law that were needed. Our mandate under the law is to preserve history. We're the home of the state archives. We're the home of the state library. We document oral histories and biographies of Washingtonians who've contributed to our history in some way. And Sam, I think, can tell you, but I know he was stopped on the street all the time from people that would come up to him and say, you need to write this down. And thinking about it as an office, we do have an obligation to document. And as I say, the big lessons are one of transparency. Every vote does count. If anybody doubts that, you can point to the 2004 governor's race in Washington and say, look. So we honored our mandate. We felt an obligation. These were circumstances that were so rare that to be able to talk about the lessons learned and how we handled it, what we would do right, maybe what we would change, would be invaluable to election administrators in the future. The voting systems and elections will have all changed, but the timeless lessons will remain.